So again, welcome back. We have just watched this OSCE documentary, A Dark Place, on the safety of female journalists online. And we are here now to discuss these issues with a panel of 3 experts that comprises Julia Haas from the Office of the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media, Gill Phillips, who is the Director of Editorial Legal Services for The Guardian, and Rebecca Vincent, the Director of International Campaigns for Reporters Without Borders. Thank you very much to all the 3 experts who join us today. I'm really delighted to have you here and join us in this conversation. Before we open up the floor for any questions or comments that our attendees may have, I would like to give the floor to Julia for a few minutes to tell us a little bit more about the range of efforts that the OSCE is doing in this field. The documentary that we've just watched is one of many other initiatives on this front, and it's important. It's of course important to raise awareness on the issue, but I understand there's also a few other initiatives that the OSCE have been taking over the last few years. And I was particularly curious to hear about the resource guides on the safety of women journalists online, which is perhaps a more proactive tool. It's a set of guidelines for stakeholders to take positive measures in implementing the safety of female journalists. So I would be very interested. I'm sure everyone would be very interested if Julia could tell us a little bit more about the resource guides.
Thank you very much, Volo, and thank you for organizing this screening and for organizing this panel today. I'm very pleased to be here and also that you offered us with the possibility to bring the documentary to the students, and I hope that it will be considered as a powerful and inspiring tool for many. So I will quickly go to the resource guide. Thank you very much for already introducing it, but maybe first give you a little bit of an background information, or like to put everything a little bit into perspective. So first of all, I think it's very important to start with concrete data and concrete numbers. And for those of you who might not be aware, UNESCO and the International Center for Journalists just recently, or they actually did not publish the findings of the survey yet, but already some of the outcomes which confirm a trend that I think many of us working on these issues, and I'm sure also both The Guardian and Reporters Without Borders have been noticing over the last years that 2 out of 3 women journalists have been experiencing online abuse. So that's exactly the reason why we, the OSCE, as an international security organization, have started to look at this issue. And we actually did so back in 2015, when it was still a kind of emerging trend, and we started to witness that women journalists are being particularly and often fiercely and singled out and being attacked online in a very sexualized, misogynist, and also often very coordinated and orchestrated manner. To really look at what does it mean for media freedom, for freedom of expression. And an overarching theme that we have noticed back then, and that I think unfortunately is still very valid today, is that these online attacks against women journalists have kind of the intention to push the individual woman, but also women in general, out of the public sphere. Hello, Kat. I hope she will also be joining our panel discussion afterwards. But that really the intention of this online abuse is to push women out of the public sphere, kind of denying that they have a public voice and that they have a right to participate in a public debate. And from maybe just one more background information that I find very important in this context is that we are a media freedom organization, right? So we look at how can we enable and how can we facilitate an enabling environment for free, independent, and pluralistic media. And at the same time, I think we are all very well aware that there are so many challenges currently. We have all the traditional challenges, and then we have kind of like the additional layer when we speak about technology. And now, of course, in the pandemic setting, there's even an additional set of challenges when we speak about media freedom. But I think there is one kind of red line and thread throughout, that the safety of journalists is really always kind of the top priority. Because if journalists are not safe to do their work, then of course we cannot expect them to investigate or report or hold those in power to account. And here it's really important, I think, to say that what safety means, and that safety is not only the absence of physical harm, even though very often we have just seen this last week in Greece, that in a worst case scenario, violence can really lead to a killing of a journalist, which of course is the worst case scenario, but that safety entails way more, that in the concept of safety, we also have economic, digital aspects. We also have psychological aspects. And it's really this broad concept of safety that we have to work on. And here also, as mentioned, the digital safety has a crucial aspect and an increasingly important aspect, in particular in 2021. And this has gladly been acknowledged by now, also in the OSCE context, in a ministerial council decision that was adopted by the 57 participating states in 2018 on the safety of journalists. And another aspect that's also acknowledged in that decision is that there's a distinct risk that women journalists face. So while unfortunately all journalists face a lot of risk and threats, including online, women journalists have kind of this double layer. They're being exposed and they're being attacked for being journalists, but at the same time also for being women. And this distinct risk is something that needs to be addressed. It needs to be recognized by all actors involved, and to really find solution to this distinct phenomenon, so that it's not only a kind of gendered extension, but that it's a particular and distinct phenomenon. And in this conversation, I think it's also important to discuss the intersectional levels, so that really say that also women journalists are not just one homogeneous group, but that there is also different layers of discrimination and risk within the group of women journalists. So before going to the resource guide that you already kindly mentioned, Paolo, I wanted to still mention 3 things that I find very important to kind of state from the outside. The first is that online and offline are not 2 separate spaces, right? So when we speak about public conversation, public debate, but also just interpersonal conversation and dialogue, the internet is really incredibly important in the online sphere, and there is no differentiation. And also there's always a clear link between online attacks and offline attacks. That's also something that has been clearly shown in the study that I've been mentioning before, and that if there is offline harm, very often there has been some online attacks prior to that. The second point I want to mention, and that's something that I find really very, very important, is that when we speak and look at online abuse of women journalists, we have this kind of 3 different layers. So first of all, we have an attack on an individual woman journalist, right? So we have the impact it has on her as a person, as a human being, the emotional toll, the trauma it might lead to, the consequences it might have for the personal life, the professional life, and it might lead to self-censorship or even retrieving out of the journalistic field. So the individual right to freedom of expression is impacted, and of course to non-discrimination and all these different aspects. On the second layer, we have to look at gender equality and the question of how we as society accept women to be treated in the public sphere and women journalists to be treated. So this is kind of like already the abstract and meta level to what we are discussing. And then on the third level, and I think that's really important, that's also kind of the perspective from which we as the OSCE and RFM approach the topic, is the question of media pluralism. So really the question of what does it lead to? And that has been something that we really wanted to also show with the documentary, that online abuse of women journalists lead to a decrease of pluralism, and that it really impacts the information we as society can get, and the access to pluralistic information, and to really kind of getting all the perspective and all the different views and opinions out there to be able to get a full picture. And the third and last thing I wanted to mention is that has also been a theme, I think, across the documentary, that this is a phenomenon across the entire region, across the board, regardless of which country and which context we speak about. It's an issue for everybody and everywhere. So it really requires global responses and global discussions around the region, around the issue. So what we have done at the OSCE and what we tried to do from the very outset is really to raise this awareness, to raise the understanding and the knowledge about what the issue is, both the scope, but also the magnitude. And as also mentioned, the impact it has for societies. And that was really the core of what we tried with the documentary. Our dark place, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you also regarding feedback and discussions around the film. But I think, and something that clearly has been shown in the last years is that inspiring change itself is not sufficient. And even if we look at international commitments, and for example, the decision, which is kind of like a UN resolution to compare it to, even those, they are super important and they're really necessary, but they're not sufficient as long as we don't address the implementation gap, as long as the situation doesn't really get better. Which brings me to the resource guide that Paolo already mentioned, is that we last year thought about what we as an international organization and an international institution can do to really contribute to making the situation better. So what we did is that we tried to bridge this gap by saying not what should be done, but really how can it be done and who should be doing what and how to really implement it. So we developed this resource guide, and we'll pop the link to it in the chat in just a minute, which is a really long and comprehensive document. I think it has 270 pages in total, and it identifies 10 key stakeholder groups. So really saying we have all these different actors in the spectrum of online safety. They all have a role to play, and each of them should do specific proposed actions to improve the situation. But we do not only formulate these as very abstract recommendations, but we also provide additional information and resources, and something that I find very important, good practice examples, because very often the implementation gap is also there because there is a lack of resources and knowledge about how really to address issues and to implement it. So this guide really tries to provide the guidance that is so much needed to lead to the much needed change to really address online harassment and abuse against women journalists. And I'm well aware that we don't have too much time, so I'm happy to go into detail, of course, also during the discussion. Maybe let me just briefly touch upon 3 actors that okay, you're nodding, so I'm just gonna go ahead. Thanks a lot. 3 actors that I find really very important, even though, of course, all the different actors are super important, and it's crucial that they all act upon it. But I would like to mention 3 in particular. First of all, law enforcement. Because when we look at states, very often we look at what the executive, legislative, and judiciary should be doing, and all of these state actors have an important role, but it's also really crucial to look at what law enforcement should be doing and should be doing better, because they have a key role to ensure that women journalists are feeling safe to report instances, and that also instances are being investigated and acted upon by police and law enforcement. So they are kind of the crucial first institutional support step. So it's really important that they play an act, that they have better capacities and resources to act upon online harassment of women journalists. The second actor I wanted to refer to is internet intermediaries and social media platforms in particular. Maybe we can speak about this a bit more in the discussions, but looking at where online harassment takes place, of course, these platforms are just such an important communication tool nowadays. And most of the harassment and attacks also take place via this platform. So it's really important the content moderation, content curation systems, and the architecture that is in place at these platforms. And also the question of how they organize their information landscapes and their business models and their algorithmic systems of of whether they prioritize content that increases user engagement, that might even push hatred and very problematic and disinformation and all these kind of contexts, and also hate speech and online abuse, because it brings profit. And this is the one side of the coin. And the other thing that's incredibly important when speaking about internet intermediaries and platforms is whether they provide meaningful redress and complaint mechanisms, and really the possibility for individual journalists or women or anybody really that is attacked to act against these attacks and online abuse. And the last sector I wanted to mention here briefly is the role of media outlets and newsrooms, so kind of the employer side. So the question of what should those do that have kind of a duty of care from a labor point of view when their women journalists are being attacked. And the question that is in general the question of protocols, of prevention, of preventive and protective measures to make sure that there are clear protocols and measures to be in place to support the woman journalist in case she's attacked in the way that she will need and support it. And with that, I think I will leave it. There is still 7 additional actors, but also so many different aspects that we can still speak about and how to address the issue. But I'm also very much looking forward to hearing from my fellow panelists and from the audience. So I will leave it for now and very much look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. This was really interesting, and I'm sure we can discuss some of the further details in the remainder of this conversation. But I wanted to hear for a minute from Rebecca. We know everyone who works in the field of media freedom or has an interest in media freedom knows that Reporters Without Borders is one of the leading civil society organizations in the field, and in particular, the World Press Freedom Index that they release on an annual basis is perhaps the most authoritative state-of-the-art assessment when it comes to evaluating the different degrees to which reporters and media operators enjoy their profession-specific rights in different countries around the world. The day when the new index is released, it's something that we all mark in red in our calendars. You know, is always a big moment every year. And the 2021 index was released this last week. So I understand that Rebecca could be able to share some of the new insights from the index with us. So if Rebecca wanted to speak a little bit more to this, I think that would be great, if it's okay with you, Rebecca.
Thanks very much, Paolo. Thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be speaking with you all today and alongside my excellent fellow panelists. So I followed very closely and agreed with everything that Julia said, in particular her comment about how online space and the real world are not distinct. And so what I would like to start with is maybe just a little bit of our data and some case examples as well of other kinds of threats towards women. So these are more real life manifestations of the threats that women journalists face. But I mention them because in nearly every case of a woman who faces the sorts of pressures, detentions, physical attacks that I will mention, they are also very likely to have experienced some form of this online. So not every woman that faces online threats will end up with that manifesting physically, but too often we're seeing the lines blurred there between online violence and real life violence. So I think it's all very relevant to understanding the full picture of the situation faced by women journalists around the world. So I'll start with just a bit of data, and then I would like to tell you a bit about what RSF is trying to do to address the safety of journalists issue, and then as well about a new report that we had out just last month on sexism in journalism and how that manifests online as well. So Paolo, you mentioned our World Press Freedom Index, which it was just out yesterday, so it's quite an eventful week, and that does capture a pretty comprehensive global picture of what's happening. You can look on our website, and I'll link to it in the chat when I'm done speaking so that you can find it easily, but it shows the situation in 180 countries on a range of indicators. And we believe it is really a unique tool in helping to shed light on these abuses everywhere. And it's a very useful starting point for our conversations with states in particular. No state is very happy with its score. I have to say, even towards the top of the index, we often get complaints. So that shows that we are hitting a nerve. And I think it actually can be really effective. We also have another tool that you can find on our website. It's the Barometer of Press Freedom Violations. It's updated every day, and you can see their data about journalists, citizen journalists, and media workers killed around the world per country, and journalists, citizen journalists, and media workers detained around the world. And then at the end of the year, we also publish an analysis of that year's trends. So I'm going to refer back to the one that came out in December, because that looked at 2020, and that situation is basically still what we're dealing with several months into 2021 as well. So in 2020, we saw an alarming rise in the number of detentions of women journalists in particular. Detentions of women journalists increased 35% during the year. In total, women journalists comprised 11% of journalists jailed globally in 2020. So at the end of the year, there were 387 journalists in jail around the world. The number is very similar today still. 42 of those were women journalists. Most of the newly detained women journalists are being held in Belarus. That's at least 5 women journalists currently imprisoned in Belarus, including women such as Daria Chultsova and Katsiarina Andreeva. Others are held in countries such as China. China is by far the world's biggest jailer of journalists, with nearly a third of the world's jailed journalists in China alone. At least 15 of those currently detained in China are women journalists, as well as Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. One case I'll mention in Saudi Arabia is Nasima El-Sada. I'd also like to mention Pham Doan Trang in Vietnam, who is a laureate of RSF's Press Freedom Prize, and we are campaigning very actively for her release. There's also many other forms of threats against women besides detention. I want to mention the case of Maria Ressa. Reporters Without Borders works very closely with CPJ and ICFJ to form the steering committee of the Hold the Line Coalition. We're working to try to lend some international support and protection to Maria. She faces at least 9 cases against her in the Philippines. She's been a real target of the Duterte regime. If she is convicted on all of those charges, she could be looking at a lifetime in prison. But Maria is also an excellent case study for online abuse. So I want to refer to some data. Julie Pizzetti of ICFJ led the study along with UNESCO. They did an in-depth case study on the online abuse faced by Maria in particular. They found that almost 60% of the attacks on Maria online from Facebook and Twitter were designed to undermine her professional credibility and public trust in her journalism. Credibility or reputation-based attacks frequently deployed disinformation tactics and abuse, conflating Maria and her journalism with fake news. Over 40% of these attacks were personal, often very viscerally personal, and 14% of all abuse and 34% of the category considered personal attacks against Maria could be classified as misogynistic and sexist. I'll come back to that in a little bit when I refer more to RSF's own report on sexism in journalism, but Maria has faced about every range of online threat that you can possibly imagine, and we're very concerned for her physical safety as well as a result. I also want to mention the very courageous Rana Ayub in India, who faces an unbelievable amount of pressure and an army of online trolls in India. And here in the UK, we see cases as well. I believe Gill will speak a bit more to the situation in the UK, but I want to particularly mention the situation in Northern Ireland. We've seen a real spate of threats against women journalists in particular, both online and offline. I want to mention Leona O'Neill, Patricia Devlin, and Alison Morris in particular. So impunity also continues for the past murders of women journalists such as Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, Gauri Lankesh in India, and Miroslava Breach in Mexico. In 2020, 2 women were among the 50 journalists killed around the world. They were Maria Elena Farrell Hernandez in Mexico and Malala Maiwand in Afghanistan. And just last month, in March 2021, 3 young women media workers were gunned down in Jalalabad, Afghanistan. Sadida Sadat, Shahnaz Rufi, and Mursal Wahidi. So this situation is very actively continuing. One measure that RSF is advocating to address the issue, this pervasive impunity for killings of journalists in particular and other safety issues, is the establishment of a UN Special Representative for the Safety of Journalists. Now, this wouldn't be specifically on women journalists, but on all journalists. However, it would really also need to focus on these specific issues facing women journalists to be effective. So this would be a representative of the UN Secretary General that would be tasked specifically with this issue. There are other UN mechanisms, existing resolutions. There's a large body of international framework that is supposed to be addressing this issue, but it has been really largely ineffective. So as a result, we're looking at year by year increased violence, increased hostility towards journalists, and this continued climate of impunity. So it's clear that something needs to change. And we believe that this so-called protector of journalists at the UN would be an effective way forward. So Secretary General Antonio Guterres said to RSF at the start of his first term that he would do this, but it would take time. Now we're in the last year of his first term in office. So we're trying to turn up the heat and really campaign for him to make that a reality this year before the situation further exacerbates. So I'm happy in the discussion or after the event to talk more about our campaign to create a UN Special Representative for the Safety of Journalists, if it's of interest. And I want to mention this report. Last month, we published, in fact, on International Women's Day, a report called Sexism's Toll on Journalism. This is focused on the impact of sexism and sexist violence on women journalists around the world. Just to clarify, our report defines sexism as all forms of gender-based violence, including discrimination, insults, sexual harassment, unwanted touching, verbal and physical sexual assaults, threats of rape, and even rape itself. So that's the scope of this report. 84% of respondents stated that sexual harassment occurs against women journalists in their country. 30% said sexual assault. 27% said rape threats, and 7% of respondents said that rape occurs against women journalists in their countries. Now, a staggering 73% of gender-based violence occurs online, according to the results of our survey. 58% took place physically in the workplace, 47% by phone, and 36% physically in the street. 15% by letter, and 13% physically at home. But again, 73% of the violence that we tracked targeting women journalists in particular occurred online. So by far the internet is now the most hazardous place for women reporters, far more than in the field. 58% of respondents also said that sexual violence occurs in the newsroom. So this is an issue within the industry itself too. The biggest perpetrators are superiors. 51% of these reported incidents took place by one superior, and people in positions of power as well, that was 50%, followed by colleagues, 46%. So this is not just an external threat, although there are many external actors as well that are responsible for such threats. But it's clear that the industry itself, that the media need to take this very seriously internally and create better, more enabling and protective environments for women journalists to do their jobs in the newsrooms and in the fields and online. I will share as well the link to that report in the chat so that you can find it easily. And then just finally to mention, this year we've also launched a new campaign focused on supporting, protecting and empowering women heroes of journalism around the world. So we're just getting started on that. Please watch this space, but we're looking for creative ways really of amplifying these courageous women around the world. Some of the cases I've mentioned already, but also underrepresented voices, in particular, those who don't already have this sort of international profile and platform. So very happy to talk about that too. I will leave that here for now because I know Gill will have much to add, but happy to get into any of that further in the conversation.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you very much. And let's pass the floor to Gillian now. So The Guardian, of course, is one of the most well-known, well-respected outlets at the global level, not just here in the UK. It's also been one of the outliers, perhaps, when media outlets started to go online. So I was wondering if you wanted to say a few words about how the dynamics that were described in the documentary, and also what Julia and Rebecca discussed just now, how do they resonate from a point of view like yours?
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. It's been really fascinating. I have seen the film before, I think in Brussels, maybe at a conference maybe not even last year, when we were all allowed to physically be in proximity to each other. And it just reminded me of what an important topic this is, but it also reminded me of how much progress has been made in terms of getting it onto agendas, which is testimony to the work of the OSCE and UNESCO and various other groups over the last few years, really. I mean, just to pick up on a few threads, and I'll try to stay reasonably brief so that we can have a discussion if we can. Just on the sexism in journalism point, it just occurred to me, I was listening in on a sort of symposium earlier in the week, and someone presented some stats about coverage of media freedom and freedom of expression. And one of the killer stats was that when people were doing stories about the Media Freedom Coalition, the thing set up by the UK and Canada back in 2019, I think, one of the names that came up most was George Clooney, because he is Amal Clooney, who had a very important role. He's her husband and he's famous, and more people managed to report his name than they did her name in their stories. So, that sort of reflects what Rebecca's been saying and what Julia's been saying about how women are perceived generally in these things, how journalists themselves cover these topics, which is also an issue. And to sort of bring things down to the UK perspective a little bit, I mean, there is no doubt that the UK is no different to anywhere else. Abuse, harassment, threats against female journalists online is a real problem here as much as it is anywhere in the world. And we shouldn't be arrogantly thinking that it's not our problem here, because it is. And it's, in some instances, some of the harassment is clearly coming from coordinated groups abroad, but a lot of it is coming from our own home territory, from people on our own home territory, which raises some issues. Just a few sort of facts and figures. There was a survey by the editor of the Oxford Mail, Samantha Harmon, in September last year, and she found that female journalists faced threats of rape, racial abuse, and also that, I think this is something that Julia mentioned, their families are threatened, their personal information is posted online. There are sort of actions that are taken just because they're women that you don't see so much with men. There is something about the targeting of them because of their sex that is very worrying. And I mean, from the Guardian's perspective, Paolo, we really cottoned onto this thanks to a rather fantastic now ex-journalist of ours, Becky Gardner, who now teaches at Goldsmiths in part of the University of London. And with her assistance, the Guardian launched a project called The Web We Want. And it looked at the rising global phenomenon of online harassment generally, and it commissioned some research into the comments on its own site since 2016, and it looked at all those comments. And I think nobody was really expecting then what came out of it, although, as again Julia has said, it sort of confirmed a trend that people were suspecting. And it was one of the first bits of sort of quantitative research evidence around this, that from the Guardian's perspective, the articles written by women attracted more abuse and dismissive trolling than those written by men, regardless of the topic of the article. The topic of the article didn't matter. Women were targeted. And what it showed was that out of the 10 most abused writers, 8 were women and the 2 men were black men. So, it raised a real consciousness in The Guardian of a problem that we'd sort of suspected but hadn't really identified, and feeds into the narrative that we've all been discussing and viewing today. And, on the back of that, the Guardian then, because we didn't really have any procedures, we put in place some, not rocket science, some guidelines for two sets of guidelines, actually, a set of guidelines for managers on what to do if their staff came to them to say they were harassed, because managers didn't really know what to do. They didn't, the temptation was to say, well, come offline for a bit, take yourself away. And as Laura Kunsberg says in the film, that's just letting the people who are abusing you win. So you have to move on from that. So sort of some guidelines for managers on how to help staff who are facing these problems, and some guidelines for staff about what they could do in order to help themselves, but to take proportionate measures as appropriate, depending on the level of the threat. And in addition to that, we also, I think, cleaned up our own act. We looked at our comments, we looked at the articles we were posting comments on. We reduced the number of articles that we opened for comment, and we sort of focused on quality and of the discussion rather than on quantity of the comment, which tended to be the thing in the early days. Volume seemed to count for more. And we also introduced the idea of the journalist or the author of the piece themselves being involved below the line to contribute to the discussion. And all of that helped us have a much better, nicer, more polite conversation on topic about things. So that sort of, just those really quite practical measures came out of that bit of research that we did back in 2017. So I think just a couple of other things to mention in terms of sort of the discussion. One of the things we have to be really careful about, and it is a difficult balance sometimes, is not to over censor. There is a temptation for people, and it's the problem with the internet generally, disinformation, fake news, you say it's fake and the platforms take it down and think that that's the solution, whereas actually it's not the solution. It may be the solution, but the irony seems to be those occasions when you want them to remove abusive comments quickly, they don't do it quickly. They're slow, their mechanisms for complaint are slow. They seem reluctant to accept a sort of, mild level of abuse can amount to harassment, and therefore, even if one single comment is okay when you look at it in isolation, collectively, in a coordinated way, it's a problem. They're not nuanced about how they deal with the problem. So there is an issue about making sure that these big tech platforms, which have a lot of power in these spaces, don't over censor just because that's the easy thing to do, but making sure that they also get the right balance in terms of protecting the people who are being attacked. And I mean, we've had an example recently, not actually of a platform online, but of someone being sent emails. It's quite easy to find out a Guardian journalist's email, and we're on Google Mail, Gmail. You'd have thought that when we sort of go to the email provider and say, look, someone is abusing, here's the address of the person who's sending these emails, you'd think that they would do something about it. But we tried through the report abuse route, the one that they have on the website. Nothing happened at all. So we went through the comms people because we have a link with them, and we did speak to a human, but they were very dismissive of the the complaint. And so if we as a media organization struggle to make the platforms and the social media companies respond properly to proper concerns, heaven help individuals on their own. And I just think that they do need to get a lot more savvy and realistic, but balanced and nuanced about their responses. So there are issues around content moderation, what they do, how they do it, who they're letting do it, whether they're using humans or AI, or whether they have proper report abuse buttons like most of us would do. That there are issues around what content is removed, how quickly, whether you can appeal, the complaints mechanism. And then there's a whole sideline, and these are some of the actors, Julia, that you've mentioned. But when does the state get involved with this? When do you criminalize this sort of speech and abuse? I read a report this February, I think, saying how long it took state prosecutors to prosecute these things compared to, say, the German Netz law, which requires things to be taken down in 24 hours. If you go through the state prosecution service, I think they said in the UK, it took on average 393 days from the date of the alleged offence for there to be a prosecution. Austria seems to take over 1,000 days from the date of the alleged offence. Denmark, likewise. So, there's a real imbalance here about how things are handled, when things are escalated. And the final thing is, lurking in all this is educating people at the bottom end, schools, about how this is just not acceptable, this sort of behaviour generally. And that's a policy society issue, which is beyond me. So I'm gonna stop there and go back to you, Paolo.
Thank you, Gill, and thank you everyone, of course. While I send a quick reminder to all the attendees that there's still a couple of minutes time to write down a question if there's something they would like to engage our speakers on. I was hoping to be able to pull some of the threads from the things that you three have been saying, but there's really so much. It's such a rich discussion that it's even somehow difficult to choose. But I think one common thread that is emerging from both the documentary and some of the things that Julia for sure, and also now Gill were saying, is on the role of platforms and digital intermediaries. So I was hoping to pick your ideas, your impressions in these last few minutes about the specific legal frameworks that at present govern the actions and the responsibilities of these digital platforms. There's a lot of conversation going on over the last few years, perhaps, about platforms taking more of an active responsibility, almost a duty of care in certain respects, in taking a harder stance on hate speech. We have examples at the national level. Gill mentioned the German law, which was, again, a little bit of an outlier in a sense, but we also have the Code of Conduct on Hate Speech. At the EU level, we know the Digital Services Act may be coming along in a short time from now. And these are general frameworks that govern platforms' responsibilities in taming down hate speech or harmful speech in general. But I'm also thinking of what Rebecca was mentioning before, the need for more targeted frameworks that protect those who are more exposed to certain type of threats, such as women journalists. So I was hoping to hear from you about your impressions about the frameworks that we have at the moment and they're being developed as we speak for platforms' duties of care, and whether you think these are likely to be effective frameworks, or if you would like to see policymakers and lawmakers perhaps going in a different or a slightly different direction in that respect. I don't know whether any of you would share their impressions on this.
Look, I'll start very briefly because I think Rebecca and Julia will have probably more to say than me on this. But, obviously in the UK, we've got the online harms stuff going through slowly and slower. And that does look at imposing this duty of care on platforms. I mean, it's somewhat worryingly vague still about who will be caught over what is a harm, is it a legal or an illegal harm, and how all that's defined. So there's an awful lot of work and discussion still to have on that. But I do think having moved from, I guess, the sort of slightly old-fashioned now view that, when the platforms first arrived, they were private commercial vehicles operating by their own terms and conditions, and that seemed fine. And then their power and scope, increasingly their influence in the public space, made that not fine. And so what we're looking for is, and they would say that they're not publishers, they're just hosters of content, so they have a different role. All of these discussions seem to me to be becoming much more focused now on the fact that they can no longer avoid their responsibility, and that they have to put the resources into that others do. As a small-ish, although well-influenced media publisher, we have human moderators. We employ a team of human moderators at quite a lot of expense, round the clock, to keep an eye on all this stuff. And Facebook and Twitter and the others cannot anymore sort of refuse to engage with that level of responsibility for what they carry on their platforms. So I'll leave the rest of it for Julia and Rebecca.
Yes, I'm very happy to jump in here. I mean, I think there are so many different layers that fall into this discussion. And I think a couple of keywords that you mentioned that I would like to follow up on is, first of all, this power imbalance that you're just referring to, Jill, because we really speak about those platforms that have, I mean, they're private actors, as you said before, but they have this immense power, and they cannot excuse themselves by just being hosts or pretending to be hosts and not being editors, because they're gatekeepers to our information. I mean, nowadays, we have access to information over these platforms, and the power they have, of course, have an incredibly big or draw an incredibly big responsibility. And I think that because your question referred to the framework that is in place, I think one of the main challenges that we face is that we currently still have this idea of self-regulation, and this idea that the platforms can find the best solutions themselves and that they can regulate themselves by now, for example, Facebook introduced this oversight board, which of course is an important step because at least it has some kind of independence and is a step to provide complaints to, but it is still so incredibly intransparent and no oversight, no public oversight, and no access to how they're doing their content moderation and content creation. So we have basically no information and possibility to even scrutinize them. So I think we really have to go beyond this discussion and include all these different aspects that were mentioned already. For example, I think it's really important what Jill mentioned before, that states with kind of like outsourcing their own judicial responsibilities to these platforms, they incentivize the use of AI, because how is a platform able to detect even terroristic content, which might be even easier to identify than hate speech, because hate speech is such a vague concept with no international definition whatsoever. So it's impossible to outsource this to algorithms that are context blind and that will either lead to overblocking, as we have heard before, to this incredibly big problem of censorship, private censorship, but also false negatives. So a lot of hate speech that is still out there that is not being detected, that's an equally problematic issue. So I think we really have to take all these different levels into it. We have the issue of human moderators, but also there we have to look at, of course, the well-being and the question of who is moderating all this content online. And we have the issue of scale. We have all these different challenges, but we really have to address it in a holistic manner. And I think it's really important, as I said before, to move beyond this idea of they can regulate themselves and they can figure out themselves. But we have to go to the point of identifying regulatory mechanisms where there are necessary to really put the human rights at the center and at the core to make sure that our freedoms and our rights are protected online. And I think that also goes in this discussion around ethics versus human rights, and that's so often this big very, very powerful platforms want to kind of excuse themselves by saying we are ethical instead of really referring to the international human rights framework.
Just to add to that, I completely agree about the need for holistic solutions, including in the legal framework here. Just to pick up where Gill left off on online harms in the UK, we have engaged closely in that process. It will very much depend on what the draft looks like when it comes, but we would encourage policymakers here in the UK to not approach that process in isolation from the separate process that DCMS has launched looking at safety of journalists. We feel that these should be considered together actually and ensure that they're mutually collaborative and reinforcing. DCMS launched a national committee for the safety of journalists last summer, and about 2 months ago, maybe actually just a month ago, time is not passing normally in the pandemic, launched the first ever national action plan for the safety of journalists. So it will also look in the UK context at safety in particular, but you know, these things, even though it's some of the same people in government working on them, they're kind of being approached in silos. We would like to see that integrated a bit more. And Paolo, I think your initial question was just more about the sort of, if I'm remembering correctly, what we view existing frameworks as internationally as well. So as mentioned, when I spoke about our campaign to establish a UN Special Representative on the safety of journalists, there are other mechanisms existing, and some of them are good, but it's just not enough. We need to see implementation of these commitments. All states are committed already to be tackling these issues. This should not be the case anywhere, least of all in regions like Europe that are really meant to get it right. But far too many of the cases that I've mentioned earlier that were featured in this film as well are happening in states that know better already. And it's because there are a range of other actors as well, and things are not necessarily being seen through. So we need first and foremost implementation of the mechanisms that exist, and we feel a position like the UN Special Representative to pull it all together to really ensure follow up on these things, not just actions. It's really time, sorry, not just words. It's really time for actions to see these words through.
Thank you. That was absolutely interesting, and I agree with. I think this is another general thread that is emerging: the need for holistic frameworks, which I think it also resonates very nicely, very consistently with what we heard at the beginning from Julia about the whole system of resources that OSCE has put together. If I remember correctly, consists of 10 points to be implemented from authorities. So I think even from just a quantitative perspective, it also gives the sense of how all the dots here need to be connected together, and the situation needs to be assessed as a whole rather than as a set of discrete situations. I think it's interesting to consider the need for holistic approaches with the need also for targeted approaches, such as what Rebecca was mentioning before about the new UN Special Rapporteur hopefully being having the right powers and right attention to really cater for the specific situation. So I need to balance both these perspectives, perhaps. I think we, Julia here says, unfortunately, there are no quick fixes to complex challenges such as online abuse against women journalists. Yes, absolutely. That's unfortunately completely, I completely agree. I think we need to bring this to a close soon because we're already running a few minutes late. But before we wrap it up, perhaps I wanted to hear from our three panelists if they wanted to have just one closing line, if there was one final key comment, one recommendation perhaps for any relevant stakeholders, whether it's policymakers, lawmakers, or different actors in the field. Just one final comment or recommendation that you would like to make that hopefully can make a positive impact, help the situation to improve, and hopefully soon.
I'm happy to start, as this is always the most difficult question. I think I have to disappoint you that there, unfortunately, is not one sentence that would kind of like fix it. Something maybe just I would choose now, because we didn't really touch upon it in the discussions, and I find very important, is that we have, I mean, it kind of links to this need for a holistic approach that we now discussed in the end, but I really think it's important also for those who work on the issues to have this intersectional discussion and view on it, because there are all these different challenges that add on. So we are now in a situation where we know journalists are being attacked and women journalists have a greater risk. And then we also have to look at other layers which might lead to increased exposure and risk for attacks and discrimination. And then we also have to look at the specific situation. And there, I think it's also important to look at the pandemic now, where we have seen that again, those who are already kind of like either marginalized over time or who have a greater risk of being attacked and kind of marginalized or pushed out of the public debate, they are again like affected more. And that's something that I think always needs to be kept in mind, and all actors have to always address that as long as we allow kind of this narrative of othering the media and othering specific groups within the media or within society, any risks and negative developments always have a greater impact on those parts and those groups and voices that had already been marginalized, which has a really detrimental impact on our pluralism and possibility as society to get the full picture.
Absolutely. And I'll even take it a step further and say that as with other safety of journalists issues, as with other press freedom violations, the ultimate impact is on the public. And that's something that is not maybe considered enough, is that when women journalists are threatened in this way, when they are made to feel unsafe doing their jobs, when they begin to self-censor, the ultimate impact is on the public. It's on the public's right to know. This negatively impacts the stories that will get out. We never will know what will go unreported because women journalists feel unsafe in doing their jobs. So this is very, very relevant to everyone. It's not just a gender issue that should be compartmentalized, but it impacts every one of us. And maybe I could end with just a very brief, like concrete, practical note here, which is, I know so many courageous women who will minimize these things happening to themselves, not just journalists, but those of us who work in the free expression space, human rights advocates, women who are really outspoken online. And many are facing this sorts of abuse, but we all will point to others who have it worse and very often not take it as seriously as we should. But my advice to any woman that encounters this online is to report, to block, do whatever you need to A, flag it for the platforms, flag it for the authorities if it's something violent in nature, if it seems to be an actual threat, report it to the police. And do whatever you need to make your online space feel safe, because the alternative is then just not engaging in public discourse, and we need strong female voices out there in the public eye. So please take it seriously, and please do anything that you need to. Don't ever feel bad for muting or blocking or, you know, otherwise just disengaging with abusive accounts. You don't owe anybody your time who is not behaving in a civil manner online. This is not a public service. So that's what I would end with.
Thank you. I mean, I obviously echo what Rebecca and Julia have said. I mean, I think, okay, from me, you know, the pathways to safety that are open to journalists generally and women journalists in particular who are at risk are too few. Those that do exist are too slow, too burdensome, and too difficult to navigate. And most of that lies in the hands of the platforms. I think that's a key element that they just have to, as we've said, take responsibility for. I also think that we need to make our prosecutors, our police, our judges much more savvy that this is a real serious problem. I think they don't take it as that. I think it's getting slightly better. I think that there is a real cross-border issue. You know, if someone is being harassed by an account in Serbia or Kosovo or France or Germany and they're in England, what's going to happen about it? How quickly is it going to be resolved? So I think there are those sorts of issues. And I also think that Rebecca's and RSF's idea of a UN rapporteur sounds like a really, really good idea, because they do tend to provide a focus for things in a way that it's very hard to achieve in this sort of area.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to these three wonderful panelists, Gill Phillips, Julia Haas, Rebecca Vincent. Thank you so much for this very engaging conversation. I'm not disappointed at all in the closing lines from Julia and Gill and Rebecca. I think they very much captured the sense of the complexity of the issues that we have discussed today, and some possible silver linings, some ways forward in which hopefully we can reconvene in some time from now. I would be absolutely delighted to continue the conversation, and hopefully in the future RSF will be in the position to report on some at least slightly better figures. Let's hope for some positive change in the near future, in the near future, as well as, of course, in the medium to longer term. I will stop the recording now, and thank you very much again for being with us today. Thank you.
Thanks very much.